Just some housekeeping items. Um, Please note that all information contained in the webinar today is a statement of opinion and not statement of fact or a recommendation to purchase, sell, or hold any securities. And we also recommend that you speak with a qualified financial advisor regarding your own unique circumstances. We also wanted to let you know that this webinar is, you're not allowed to record this webinar without Moody's explicit permission and quote any of the comments made or questions asked by the webinar audience. The webinar is being recorded and we'll share the recording with the attendees in the coming weeks. All the members of the audience will be on mute, but if you have a question, and we do encourage you to have them, please type them in the Q&A box, but we ask that you keep them generic and avoid personal or client-specific information. Okay, on to our panelists for today. So we have Yasmin Pallan, who's the Director of DE&I at Scotiabank Global Wealth Management. And as part of her distinguished career at Scotiabank, she has led various D&I initiatives, including launching the Women of Wealth Employee Resource Group and overseeing the Global Wealth Management DE&I sponsorship program, and developing the bank's first enterprise-wide DE&I strategy, in addition to supporting the group head and CHRO on key human resources priorities. She has also held leadership roles in marketing as well, and she is a dedicated mentor and advocate, serving on the advisory board at the American Marketing Association, Toronto, and the board of directors for Viva Singers in Toronto. We also have Sean, who's the Senior Director of Diversity and Inclusion Strategy Enablement and Reporting at RBC, and there he provides strategic direction on DE&I data collection, governance, and analysis to ensure compliance with global standards and advancing organizational commitments. Sean has over 15 years of experience in HR strategy, change management, talent development, and is extremely passionate about identifying opportunities to help individuals and organizations thrive. He has held leadership roles in skill strategy, job architecture, and people assessments as well. He's also been a faculty member at the School of International Business at Seneca. And thank you, Yasmin and Sean, for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Yes, we're excited to have you. So what we have been noticing, I'm sure members of the audience have been as well, is that DE&I has taken center stage in not only in financial services, but for our topic today, that's the area we'll focus on. And that tells us that it's becoming essential for us to explore how these initiatives intersect with shareholder expectations, employee engagement, and advisors' own practices as well. So I'd like to start by asking you, Sean, if investor and shareholder expectations are truly evolving to prioritize DE&I, and if they are, how are these changing demands shaping the industry? And what are some of the steps organizations are taking to adapt along with investors and shareholders?
It's a great question. As I was reflecting on it, I would say beyond issues related to the pandemic, D&I has probably had the most focus over the last 5 years in the HR and talent space. So certainly significant shifts started after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of organizations responding. Certainly folks in the financial services have been working on D&I long before that and really had well-established practices. But for many of our partners or clients or investors or other stakeholders, it hasn't been the case. And so certainly many shifts in the past couple of years. I would say, starting with that, there has been increased focus on transparency. We saw that as the shift with ESG topics as a whole. Certainly it started, I think, with environment, and there's been a focus on climate, but that's now shifting into the S on social issues more broadly. And so the ask for transparency has, where we began with optional standards, is starting to move to more mandatory standards from regulatory bodies, but also just requests that we are getting from investors and other shareholders as well. You see it in investor proposals or shareholder proposals that we've been receiving, but also in regular shareholder meetings. With that, of course, there has been a focus on social washing. As we looked at greenwashing, those same investors and shareholders are looking at how are you delivering on what you're saying you're doing? How are you being clear about what your commitments are and how you're achieving them? And certainly that, I think, has also changed the view of some of the regulators in the space and the increased focus and creation of standards like those from SASB, and shifting more to the mandatory space. Of course, this world has also shifted again, I think, in the last year. And certainly that's been pushed a bit more from a political angle of shareholder activism, particularly in the States, some of the work that's happening there, organizations that are either pulling back or evolving their DE&I strategies, just given the activism that they are seeing, and just also the investor questions as well. So that's creating an interesting space, and I think you've listed it as navigating complex dynamics. Certainly, D&I has never been an easy place to work. Anyone, we were speaking about yesterday on our prep call, this is a space where folks have lots of passion to work, but there's a deep complexity to the amount of work in balancing the different viewpoints that are coming from all different angles. Certainly on one side, you've got the desire for how are organizations doing more and how are they being more transparent about those initiatives. And of course, now we're seeing political movements on have you gone too far? And so organizations are now going to have to walk that in lockstep. And also knowing that, of course, geographically, that's not one harmonized view either. Depending which jurisdiction you operate in, there are different viewpoints from those. And so there will be an increased regulatory presence that we will have to navigate as organizations. Maybe I'll pass to Yasmin for your perspective on this as well.
Yeah, for sure, Sean. I mean, and I think that's such a great macro picture. And so kind of drilling down into financial institutions, given the kind of environment and the context that you've provided, I think now more than ever, leadership, tone from the top, leadership that supports diversity is so important. Certainly, in Canada and the financial institution space, we are not seeing, we are not retrenching, we are not backing away from this. I mean, diversity is a fact, and inclusion, belonging, those are choices that we consciously make every day. And I think there's a really strong case to be made for the importance of leadership that supports diversity. I mean, I was just reading an HBR study that said organizations with inclusive leaders are 17% more likely to report that they are higher performing, 20% more likely to say that they make high quality decisions, 43% more committed to the company, and 51% more likely to recommend the company as a great place to work. So I think that, leadership that places emphasis on continuous listening and understanding employee sentiment, especially in these times, is more important than ever. And what that leads to when you have diverse leadership and an open, transparent leadership team with diversity that is and inclusion efforts that are supported by a strong governance framework, you have a positive impact on employee experience, and employees that feel that they're included, that they have a voice, that they're integrated within the culture of an organization and have a strong sense of belonging where they can bring their best selves to work. I think without ongoing employee listening or consultation, we see sometimes this is where organizations may lose a bit of momentum. It should be nothing about us without us. Authentic employee listening and the thoughtfulness of ideas and taking into consideration diversity of thought, through things like surveys, setting up check-ins, regular meetings, is really going to keep employees engaged and committed with a strong sense of belonging. I think leaders need to recognize employees for sharing honest feedback and diverse feedback, and that we need to, as organizations, create safe or safer spaces for employees to do that. And additionally, I would say, at this level, more than ever, it is important to commit to continuous learning in the diversity, in the inclusion space. We all have biases. Somebody once said to me, if you have a brain, you have bias. And so how do you build your own self-awareness and awareness of others to kind of be conscious of understanding and recognizing when and where bias exists, and making sure to educate ways to overcome unconscious bias. Inclusive hiring practices, inclusive language, inclusive leadership, all of those things are great ways to commit to that.
And maybe if I can just pull on your point there on leadership, Yasmin, I couldn't agree more. Certainly spoke to one of our HR VPs last week, and she said, I conduct so many exit interviews with folks in the organization, and one of the top reasons folks leave is leadership and views of leadership, and not feeling connected to that leader's vision or feeling included as part of the team, right? And so I think living those values is so important to this work.
Yeah, I mean, inclusive leadership is something I think that everyone can get behind. And I mean, yes, inclusive leadership certainly at a senior executive level, but in the spirit of we are all leaders, leading with empathy and humility and vulnerability and resilience. I mean, these are things that we can all get on board with. And the perception of inclusive leadership is a really strong indicator of driving people's sense of belonging and their engagement. So yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with what you're saying.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for that. And on the same note, Yasmin, that DE&I is a very important driver of employee performance and engagement. What does that look like in practice at leading FIs, and like how can they truly foster an environment that supports their growth and progression and their sense of empowerment, like you said?
So I wanted to touch on a couple of things in this area, because of course this is kind of the crux of what DEI practitioners do, is to, attract, develop, promote, retain diverse talent, create a sense of belonging and engagement, foster a culture of, belonging where people that is built on visible actions and commitment. But I really want to start with data. I would say, Sean alluded before that DEI, we're certainly in this DEI 2.0 phase since the murder of George Floyd, and now maybe 2.1, I don't know, with recent events. But one of the things I think that we have at our disposal now more than ever is robust DEI data. And it's something, it can establish a really good baseline in driving change in organizations and driving the right initiatives forward. So I just wanted to take a moment and talk a bit about, you have outcome metrics. So outcome metrics are really your demographic data. So where people are, how they identify, kind of, where those people sit within the organization. And those metrics are really, really important to understand, because that, like I said, they're a good indicator of bias, I would say, and they also are vital for establishing that baseline. And so once we understand kind of our diversity metrics, we can start to invest in areas of underrepresentation. So before we do that, then we look at process metrics. And process metrics are really taking a step back and saying, okay, what processes do we want to change? So for example, if we see a gap in underrepresentation in our hiring efforts, how do we pinpoint those specific issues to address that? Maybe it's about rewording job postings so that it's a skills-based approach instead of an experience-based approach. Maybe it's about sourcing talent differently and looking at different untapped pools of talent. Maybe it's about blind resumes. Maybe it's about diverse hiring panels, diverse interviewing processes where everyone gets the questions in advance of the interview so that they're all answering the same questions, so that we eliminate bias in that. I wanted to talk a bit about the intersection of outcome metrics and process metrics at Scotiabank. One of the kind of successful examples of this is and it was alluded to earlier, is the global DEI sponsorship program that was stood up a few years ago. So we knew that there were some employees that in equity deserving groups that experienced a career plateau. So what that means is they would get to a certain level and they couldn't seem to get beyond that. We also knew that there was a representation cliff. So when we looked as we went up the ladder, representation from members of equity deserving groups dropped off. And when we looked at process metrics, so we did listening sessions with women and other diverse areas across global wealth management a few years ago to kind of uncover what was happening and why this was the case. We learned a few things. We learned that women really liked their roles and wanted to stay at the bank. They wanted to advance their careers, but they didn't believe that advocating for themselves was necessarily going to move the needle. So we stood up a sponsorship program which pairs proteges with sponsors. And sponsorship, as opposed to mentorship, where mentors kind of guide you through and share their experiences with you, and it's a very one-to-one relationship. Sponsorship is more of a one-to-one to many, where you have somebody who understands your potential and advocates for you when you're not in the room. So what we gave these individuals in this program was really access to power, essentially, and access to people to advocate on their behalf. And we have measured, we've run this program now across the bank. We measure the outputs of this program. We know it takes about 2 years for people to really see that development in their career. And we have increased retention, and certainly 100% of participants in the wealth pilot that we launched a few years ago have had career development. So really promising, but that was really the intersection of process and outcome metrics, where we looked at a challenge, we created an action plan, we started small with a pilot, we communicated, and we decided who needed to know what and how we were going to leverage the data in a proper way. So I think that, it kind of starts with that. There are lots of other ways to drive engagement. Employee resource groups, if your organizations have them, they're great. If you don't have them, think about starting them. Employee resource groups foster inclusion. They improve diversity. They're certainly a strong part of any organization's employee value proposition. They help employees feel that they can be authentic. They build community. They reinforce purpose. They reinforce a sense of belonging. And so we look to, elevate those ERGs at every opportunity, as well as building a culture of allyship. I believe that we all have a responsibility to listen and learn from our colleagues, to understand their lived experiences, certainly in DEI, but also as individuals, to take action to build greater sustainable inclusion. And so, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to challenge bias, to confront discrimination, to value every voice, and understand how to support our colleagues in order to create an environment that is safe for people to come to work. And I think that contributes to, a more inclusive environment.
Yeah, I think fantastic points to build from. Certainly, leaning in on the data as a function within HR. I think DE&I was certainly ahead of the curve in collecting data, but also making use of it in order to support some of the decisions that we make throughout the organization. And that is so increasingly true. I spoke about the increased transparency, so now we are sharing more and more of this externally with our shareholders and investors and other interested parties to learn more about what we're doing in this space. And it's not only quantitative, we also talk about those actions and the impact stories and case studies as well. And so I certainly would encourage folks, if you are interested more in this space, there is a lot of disclosure available now from financial institutions. If you look through their ESG reports, their annual reports, there has been an increasing focus on topics related to diversity and inclusion. There are disclosures that are pages and pages long of all the different initiatives and activities that some FIs, certainly in the Canadian market, are doing. And so if anything, we can't say there's a lack of data available, both to look at ourselves internally in organizations, but also benchmark and compare ourselves to our competitors or maybe indirect competitors as well, to understand what they're doing to shift the needle, certainly on inclusion activities and equity activities. That being said, of course, as we are now operating in this new environment, we are looking at how do we speak about diversity and inclusion? How do we speak about diversity being an outcome of really investing in inclusion and equity efforts, as Yasmin alluded to? So, there's lots of great articles, particularly, I pay attention to HBR. There was a good one last week from Vijay Pendekar looking at reframing the value proposition for DE&I. Certainly as an industry, we love business cases. We love focusing on what's the return on investment of different activities. It's a DE&I, certainly a space that is a complex one because there are so many different variables. And what he sort of purports in the article is to look more at shifting towards certainly performance, but a different way of looking at performance, that maybe complexity is what we are aiming for as organizations, that if you are doing diversity and inclusion right, you should feel some friction, right? So if we think of how that applies to everyday teams, if you have a team with diverse perspectives and are inclusive of different folks from different backgrounds and demographics, you should feel it. You should hear, if you've created that safe environment that Yasmin mentioned, folks should feel safe to speak up and question different decisions that are being made. And that's how inclusion really comes to life in organizations. And so really like his angle on friction being a comfortable thing, and being uncomfortable should be how we look at inclusion efforts. Because if not, then you've got what we talked about in the early 2000s around groupthink, right? Where everyone's thinking the same. If you don't have any friction, then you are unlikely to be a very productive and high-performing organization, because you are all thinking on a very narrow path. So I think we come back, looking at lots of opportunity to innovate with metrics, to dive deeper into data. I really like the case study that Yasmin provided of looking into talent pipelines. It's not enough just to look top of house aggregate measure, especially in organizations. Some of our organizations are quite large, and aggregation really misses where are the potential areas of bias, where are the structural issues that may exist in some of our organizations. And so we need to dive a little bit deeper into some of those metrics and to disaggregate a bit more to find where the opportunities are. And for leaders to pay attention to that data as they are looking at how do they, are employees on their teams feeling that this is an inclusive team that they've created? Where do they need to rebalance their efforts and look for opportunities to find opportunities to make folks feel more included? Looking at more broadly what organizations can do, many of us participate in rating and ranking agencies. So certainly from an advisory perspective, if you're looking, there are great measures out there. London Stock Exchange Group, Bloomberg provides a gender equality index. You've got Human Rights Campaign that does comparative analyses as well, where organizations have submitted their data. You have an opportunity to objectively look at what are they meeting benchmarks? How are they comparing to each other? And make decisions based off of the information that those organizations are providing. So some opportunity in the macro space as well. And then, sorry, go ahead, Yasmin.
No, go ahead.
I would say to build off Yasmin's point, lots of opportunity to look at where there are always opportunities for bias. So if you are not seeing the friction, identify those places, looking at some of our processes and procedures. How are we checking our potential bias when we're making decisions around, promotional opportunities? As we're looking at our job candidates, have we made enough of an effort to ensure that we're providing equal access for folks to be able to compete for those positions? How are we looking at performance? Are we as you look through all your performance reviews, maybe many of you are like me, or in the year-end cycle as you're reviewing them, are you providing the same or equivalent feedback to folks on your team? Are you really focusing on objective measures around individual skills and tying it back to that? There are many places. I think we've got opportunities to sort of check our potential bias at the door and start to break down where there might be potential systemic issues. So there's something that we can each do in organizations. I kind of say my role is a bit of a ghost of Christmas past sometimes. I'm the person who provides a lot of the data on where things have come in the organization, but I don't own a lot of the levers, right? I have to impact and influence throughout the organization. I have a small team. I may hire, one or two people in a year, where we've got folks who are hiring and promoting, dozens, if not hundreds of folks in the organization, right? So for the folks that own those levers that can make that impact, those are the opportunities, I think, to take a look at. And there's the last up I had on here was just about sort of the future of work and the future in the AI space. There are lots of opportunities here, especially in really large organizations. As we're looking at the future, certainly we have to balance privacy and security as we go through this process. But AI is giving us a lot of potential on the DE&I side to help surface where there might be issues that we need to address in the organization. A lot of that work is done very manually today, and we are looking for a bit of a needle in the haystack. I think AI gives us so much opportunity to surface where we're not trending where we want to be trending. And get proactively ahead of those things. So I don't want to be looking at the past. I want to be starting to forecast the future and to know a couple of years out if there are opportunities for us to improve access and provide more equitable opportunities in different places in the organization.
Yeah, I would say, without introducing bias into, how we're using AI too, right? I think, you talk about eliminating bias, and I think that making more data-driven decisions can also help us do that. I know we certainly have changed some of our selection process for programs, for example, whereas before we might ask managers to put forward names for participation in programs. Now we are more reliant on using data in order to eliminate bias, because what we saw historically was it was kind of the same people being picked every time. So how do we kind of check that at the door? But the other thing I wanted to go back to was you talked about friction, and I love that. I wrote that down because I think that, I've often said that my role as a DEI practitioner is to hold the space for people to step outside of their comfort zones a little bit and be a respectful disruptor and challenge people to think differently and challenge people to kind of challenge others in their conventional thinking. It also comes back to allyship and recognizing unconscious bias, calling out bias when you see it. But I think that being that disruptor in this space and being, I think that's one of the characteristics that we need to embrace. And the other is that you alluded to, lifelong learning. Like, you're constantly having to re-educate yourself. I personally am constantly having to re-educate myself on different trends and how things are changing and how things are evolving. I mean, in financial services, but beyond, in the inclusion space, it's kind of, it's ongoing, and there's something new to learn every single day. So, I think that diverse perspectives are just so incredibly important.
Yeah, but I couldn't agree more, and particularly the point about feeling uncomfortable, right? It's not okay not to feel safe at work. It is
Yeah.
okay to feel uncomfortable in different situations because that means that you are thinking about things differently, or potentially someone is challenging you in those situations. Those are really helpful examples of not being comfortable at work, and speaks to the value of inclusion and folks having an opportunity to be authentic and express their opinions. Um,
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Those were, again, I noted down the terms as well, like the idea of friction that's productive, and like you said, Yasmin, respectful disruption. That's great. I think that really sums up a lot of what you guys, like are doing with this field. And just on that note, so that does tell us that DE&I is more than just corporate responsibility, right? Just like more than targets. And it can be a really great opportunity for even advisors to reflect within their daily practices, apart from just the broader organizational goals. So, what are some of those strategies they can use to kind of champion inclusion and align their practices with their day to day interactions with clients?
Absolutely. So I would say, you know, paying attention in this space. This is a space that is constantly evolving. It will continue to evolve, especially on the political side. I think over the next year, we know that will happen. And that is not just looking at the US, I think looking politically in Canada as well. And so I think paying attention to that, both in terms of how that will impact our work, the work of our teams, I think how it will impact our clients and how they are asking us questions about what organizations are doing. And so I would say it is so important that you also are looking to the messaging that is coming from within your organizations. What is your organization's position on diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are they saying publicly? What are their values? Those are things that, we may not have thought, 10, 15 years ago that clients would be asking, but that is certainly what clients, shareholders, investors are asking now, and certainly of many folks in client-facing roles. And so I think understanding and taking advantage of the resources you have in your organization to understand that perspective and be able to answer some of those questions that maybe you have not answered before and are probably going to continue to evolve is going to be important. And I would also then echo some of my earlier points about creating those, and Yasmin's points about creating the inclusive environments. Certainly D&I is not about the targets. It is about creating access. It is about creating inclusivity and equity in our processes. The outcome is, in many cases, representation. But what we are striving for is creating those safe spaces where that can happen, and those environments where folks feel the belonging and inclusion in our organization. And that starts with absolutely everyone. Yasmin spoke about allyship earlier, and that was a key point. I would agree. We mentioned employee resource groups. There are so many opportunities to participate in those employee resource groups, whether you are there as a member who identifies as part of that group, or you're there as an ally. Those are great places that support people in networking, connecting across our organizations. They're great places where dialogues happen, where you can learn more about how people are feeling and what the situations are that they are encountering in their lives. It can only help, especially when we think of advisors, to bring that information to the table, both as you interact with colleagues, as you manage teams, as you interact with clients and better understand what their particular needs are as you're supporting them. All of that is helpful. I would say, again, sort of reiterating about checking that bias, that we are doing the work to ensure that we are creating systems and processes that enable folks to compete fairly, that we are giving folks opportunity to participate in the organization, to feel that they have a place and they can bring their authentic selves to work as well. And I would say because of the focus on DE&I over the past couple of years, there haven't been more materials available. Many organizations have training on anti-discrimination, anti-bias. There are many available in market. There are many social organizations that have also published their own materials where you can learn more about particular communities or identities or ancestry to dive more and educate yourself. And lastly, I think the key message here is that DE&I is not only about the business case. It's not only a business imperative. There's also an element of we need to do right by folks. This is creating environments where people want to work and come to work every day, and appreciating the potential that everyone can bring to an organization is a key part of our work. And so sometimes we get a little bit stuck in that business case, and we forget about the human case, and how do we make places that are better places to work.
I love that. It's the smart thing to do, but it's also the right thing to do. And I think that that you hit the nail on the head. I would just kind of build on what you're saying, especially around inclusivity as the importance of DEI work. And so, yeah, I would submit that, for smaller firms, especially, DEI is not side of desk work. Sean, you talked about earlier how, and we've said this before, passion is great. Passion is not enough to kind of take us to the next level. There is a science to DEI, there are requirements around DEI, and really it needs to be a dedicated function with dedicated resources. And if and I would suggest for organizations, if you kind of don't know where you stack up or where you are at and you just need that level set, then think about doing an equity review or an employment systems review or a maturity assessment audit or somewhere to establish benchmarks so that you know where you're at and kind of where you aspire to be. And again, really built on and based on the need to be informed by data that is kind of collected in the correct way, accessed by the correct people, and used in a responsible and respectful way as well. I mean, there's a lot of governance around how data is managed, but it's a good foundation to kind of start to make sure. More and more, I think we see in organizations that inclusion is kind of embedded into business strategy and embedded into process. And really, I think the stealth goal of any DEI practitioner should be to work themselves out of a job, because it's just the way we operate, and shift the DEI, the S focus also to the G focus in ESG, and it's just how we work. And I think the last thing I would say is to be curious. At Scotiabank, our DEI global framework is listen, educate, act, and sustain. And that's the framework where we believe it starts with listening and learning in order to take sustainable action. And I would say that we need to consider listening and learning as acts of courage. Sean, you talked about the importance of educating ourselves. It's incumbent upon us to learn about people's lived experiences, to learn about the stories of other equity deserving groups and communities across, our client base, across our employee base, our colleague base. But really, when we listen and learn, we are building empathy. And without that knowing, we cannot be empathetic and be driven to affect change by speaking up, by showing up at every level. I mean, that's a role that all of us can play.
Yep. Thank you, both of you, for your insights. These were really helpful. Um, I do want to address a few questions that we have from our audience. And I'd like to start with the one about, so we discussed DE&I and how even the quality of what we're reporting and the data is expected to improve and people want it to improve. So is there something that advisors can do to ensure that their organizations are meeting these emerging standards? More so for people like Yasmin and Sean, you guys said that are not directly involved in teams responsible for these tasks. Is there anything they can add to ensure that like there's quality reporting being done and hence we get quality data to act on?
Yeah, so I think to build from Yasmin's point, it is certainly not a side of desk activity. You do need folks who are focused on this, particularly as the regulations evolve and are changing, and also getting some legal opinions on how and what to disclose as well. This is an area that will have increased scrutiny, and I think you want to be very cautious of how we're framing things so that one, we are making sure we're staying clear of claims of social washing, that we are being very clear about what our intent is, what our ambitions are in particular areas, and the progress that we're making against it. And I guess the second point I would add is to then say maybe more of an individual advisor will look to what other organizations are doing, many other large organizations. Like I said, that disclosure is available. I always pay attention to what certainly our other FIs in Canada are doing, but also internationally as well, because that can give you indications of how the world is shifting in this space, where places are investing more in particular topics or others. It's actually at a seminar this morning. We were talking about the UK and how in the UK they have started asking more questions and disclosing more things around, for example, social mobility, and just something that we haven't seen as much of in North America yet. So certainly looking to those other outside places, benchmarking ourselves in terms of what we're communicating and how we're communicating about it is important. And I would say as well, trying to keep up with some of those standards of what's the best way to frame some of those metrics and numbers as well is always helpful. And I think we've got certainly a couple of regulatory bodies that we look at things like our Employment Equity Act, for example, gives a fairly standard way to look at the data. They've got their own tool where you can compare organizations across the country to dive more into that data too.
Yeah, I would say, there needs to be kind of really established guardrails around data. And, to your point about looking to others within your industry, lots of information available. But again, I go back to, if you want to know where you stack up, consult with a third party that does maturity assessment audits, as for a living, so to speak, or that is experienced in that, who are also well aware of the evolving regulatory environment, disclosure. We operate in a number of jurisdictions, as does RBC, and the requirements and the privacy and the risk assessment is different in every jurisdiction. So you need to also kind of understand how that fits together. So also consider that it may be beyond Canada in some instances.
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you so much. We do have an interesting question here, which talks to that. So there's been research about anti-bias training and DEI policies, increasing conflict and reducing trust by priming people to note discrimination where there might be none. So how do you do you see that? Have you witnessed that happening, or do you think that can be like a potential pitfall?
So maybe I'll touch on that earlier point around friction and some friction being very positive, right? I think I don't want to speak to that specific situation. I just would say going into a situation like that where there are claims, I would be looking at what is helpful dialogue and conversation around particular topics, because there are, you don't want to shut down conversation and stop conversation, because that training exists for a reason. And also people should feel comfortable speaking up about potential biases and issues that they are seeing in organizations as well, and raising them to their leadership as well, so that they are addressed. So I would say that it's hard to say about specific situations, but I think looking at balancing that view on friction of what is helpful, what isn't helpful conversation, making sure that we are still providing inclusive environments where people can speak up about topics that are significant issues, and taking that balance to make sure things don't go too far. I would say, about the anti-bias training, in my personal opinion, it has been helpful to learn more. It has helped me question different situations and understand folks more, and think about how I approach different situations differently. So I would say it would be a broad swath to say that all anti-bias, all anti-discrimination training has that impact. I think it has many positive benefits, and I certainly have seen how they have helped me personally in supporting my journey and learning more.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say there needs to be kind of more than one avenue for raising concerns, if possible. Some people feel comfortable going to their manager, some people don't. So if there's more than one way that you can speak up, I think that's always good. And I would say personally as well, through some of the training that I've done, recognize that I have been the source of non-inclusive behavior in instances, and learned about that, and learned about my biases as well. I think that like I said, it's a lifelong learning approach, and we're continuously evolving. But I also have found it very helpful in my personal development.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really helpful, because how I'm looking at it is also that what some might call discrimination, others might not. So, like, what really comes out of all the training and all the studies and like all the initiatives that we take is that the space becomes safe enough for somebody to call it out, right? Like you said, it's really not about what we're deeming as being discriminatory, but just that we have the space to do so. Another question that we have for you today is, we talked a lot about bias, and is there merit to helping, like we have discussed the merits of it, but like, is there merit for advisors to kind of help their clients check bias, and ensure that they are kind of objective and inclusive in considering choices in terms of like where, their own practices with the advisors, their interactions with who they choose to work with, and all of that. So I think advisors are kind of at a key point to help their clients see that, but I also just wanted to get your notes on how they can go about it.
Well, I think that certainly in the wealth space, people increasingly look to their advisors to offer more and more advice. It used to be, I don't know, 3 basis points of a fee, and now it's 25 basis points. There's been, lots of literature around how the changing role of advisors is really kind of shaping the industry. And I think that in as much as people look to their key people for advice, their trusted personal advisory boards, including their advisor, I mean, there's certainly opportunity to educate, when the circumstances allow for that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I would add to, I think the value is in really understanding as much as you can about different folks and where they're coming from, and being able to provide advice that is certainly, looks at being more personalized to folks and their personal situation and some of their life circumstances. And you can only do that as you learn more about different folks and knowing how to ask the right questions in an appropriate way, and really getting a deeper understanding of your client and their values and what their ambitions and goals are. You can't use the same, not that folks do, but you just can't use the same template with everyone. And so, that is part of the anti-bias process as well, as sort of second guessing how you approach different interactions and making sure you're taking the time to understand that client and what they value. And that may be different than yours, right? Just as we would do looking at someone's risk tolerance, right? But understanding a bit deeper about what's driving that risk tolerance, right? Did someone grow up in low socioeconomic status, and they had very different positions on life, and how they approach their financial decisions is going to look very different than a high net worth someone who grew up in a high net worth situation, right? That is also part of inclusion and diversity and understanding those folks' backgrounds and how you approach those situations.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to it's incumbent upon ourselves to learn and learn about the way different generations kind of interact with this, and the way different people of different backgrounds, communities, and experiences might receive some of this information. So I think that lifelong education is really where it starts, listening and learning.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more about the onus being on you. Certainly, I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. I hear from folks from many other communities as well that they are tired of sort of explaining all the time and having to be the person in the office that has to explain a particular situation or educate others on it. And so certainly many of us who are in roles like this, I am very comfortable about playing that role, but there are many people who have been through that many times, and it is just a lot of emotional work for them in some cases to talk about very difficult things. But many people want to be seen for their work and their skills, and not necessarily their identity. And they don't want to have to be that person who is doing the work to help educate you in that situation. So certainly taking the time to put in the effort ourselves as allies, that is part of being a very good ally, is investing your own labor in finding out more about what you can do.
Yes, thank you so much for that. A very interesting question that we have here, and that can be kind of like our ending note here, because I think you guys would enjoy it, is has DNI changed any standards around accepting employees with tattoos at banks? There's somebody asking what's the situation with people who want to show their tattoos at work. So I don't know if you guys have any comments on that, but yeah.
Yeah. Yasmin?
Well, I would say that we promote an environment, like I said, going back to respectfully valuing everyone, where people can bring their best selves to work. I mean, I think that I think that that's about bringing your best self or your authentic self in some instances. And I think that, we need to kind of sometimes challenge bias or learn from our colleagues. And, to, again, going back to creating that safe space for people, or safer space, I would say. So, I mean, and I think it's about, acceptance and working towards the goal of having kind of a meaningful impact for everyone.
Yeah, I would agree, regardless of if organizations have a policy or not a policy, right? I couldn't agree more with Yasmin's point of just understanding that person. Tattoos can be very culturally meaningful for many folks as well, and having that understanding of that person's authenticity and learning more about that, I think is important as well. But yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's the end for our Q&A session. I know we have a lot more, but I would encourage everyone to submit these at our support hub. The link is on the screen, and we would try our best to get back to you on them. Thank you for the interesting questions. And again, thank you for joining us today, Yasmin and Sean, for the wonderful session as well, and to all our attendees. We will have a recording up soon and we will email it to you. So look out for that as well. And yes, thank you so much for the session.
Thank you for sharing your lunch with us. Thank you for inviting me. I mean, it's been a pleasure to be here.
Likewise, it's a pleasure joining everyone today. Thanks for your
Yes.
attendance.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.